The program you are about to see is part of a Cal State Fullerton President's Symposium, where we offered a forum to some of the nation's leading voices on the important and pressing issues impacting and challenging public higher education and our broader communities. We hope you enjoy the program and trust it will provide valuable insights about the important issues, impacts, and challenges facing us today. At Cal State Fullerton, our daily mission is education and knowledge creation. We're committed to being a leader in creating the future of higher education.
Well, thank you. Thank you, and good morning, everybody. We're going to spend the day talking about how to confront inequality. And we're going to spend the first, or what I'm going to do in this first presentation is I'm going to give you a brief introduction into how we measure inequality and what the current trends and levels are. I'm also going to talk about mobility because inequality matters a lot more if people have less possibilities of advancement. And I'm going to end the talk with a brief comparison to other countries. I will also answer two other questions, one of which was just mentioned by President Hagen, and that is why there are so many different numbers out there, so many different estimates of income inequality and the importance of income inequality. And I will also address or talk about why we talk about the 99% and why that's actually a very good way to look at income inequality. So what do we know about inequality? When we look at the 30 years ending right before the beginning of the Great Recession, we know that income inequality has risen quite dramatically. At the same time, average incomes have also increased, and that's an important part when we want to look at income distribution. But incomes have increased more so at the top. A major contribution of that increase at the top of the income distribution was an increased share of labor and business income, as well as a decrease in the redistributive aspects of taxes and transfers over those 30 years. Now, how much exactly income has increased or income inequality has increased depends on whom you ask. And it depends on whom you ask because it depends on how we measure income inequality. Income inequality, of course, is a measure of the relative income standing of different parts of the population. But how we define income is crucial when we want to try to address or try to figure out how great income inequality actually is. And the biggest issues here are whether we look at a broad measure of income, that is, whether we look at what we call market income, that is the income that people get from their wages, through their businesses, from capital gains, or whether we look at a measure of income that is more narrow and is maybe if you want, a more accurate description of the income that people can actually use to spend. And that would be a measure of income that would deduct taxes. And President Hagen just measured taxes, right? We know taxes are progressive, so it matters whether we look at income before taxes or income after taxes. And if we look at income after taxes, of course, we find that income is less unequally distributed than otherwise. We also know that transfers matters a lot. Transfers are redistributive, and therefore, when we take into account transfers in our income measure, we'll also find less income inequality. Now you say, okay, what transfers are we talking about? We're talking about a lot of transfers. We're talking about Social Security income. We talk about Medicare, but also things like food stamps, school lunches, and other kinds of government assistance. Fringe benefits plays actually a pretty great part in the discussion of income inequality. And fringe benefits, what the most important fringe benefits are employer-provided health insurance contributions. Very important for the middle class. Do we take these into account or not? And lastly, we adjust for household size, of course. You know, if you have an income of $35,000, that means very different things for a household of 2 people or a household of 6 people. And it really depends on what years we look at, and you're going to see that in a moment, because depending on the years, we actually get very different estimates of income inequality. The two most prominent studies, and arguably the most thorough studies of income inequality, have been done by the Congressional Budget Office in a study that has come out at the end of the last year. and by two economists, one from Paris, Thomas Piketty, and Emmanuel Saez from Berkeley. These two economists have studied income inequality and the income share of the top 1% and up of the income distribution for many, many years. And for what they are trying to do, the only measure they have available is that broad measure of income, the market income, that is before taxes, before transfers. And what they find is that income inequality in those 30 years between 1979 and just the beginning of the Great Recession has increased dramatically. The income share of the top 1% has increased from 9% to 23.5%, so 2.5 times as high. If instead we use the narrow measure of income, the measure that better captures standard of living, what you find is that those numbers are a lot smaller, but they're still very high. According to the CBO, the income share of the top 1% has increased from 8% to 17%. Still high, but lower than the estimates by Piketty and Saez. If you look at the row underneath, you can see that the next 19% of the income distribution really hasn't seen any change in its share. Not much going on there. But everybody else has seen a decrease. The middle 60% have seen a decrease in their income share from about half of all income to 43%, and the poorest 20% have seen their share decrease by 2 percentage points to 5%. Now, what happened after 2007? And we don't really know very much about that yet because we don't have a lot of data available. We do have some estimates by Piketty and Saez, and again, these use the broad measure of market income. They have found, if you look on the top row in white, they find that in 2010, the share of income of the top 1% was about 20%. Okay? Just to bring you back to that, that is lower than it was in 2007, but still a lot higher than it was in 1979, and that's really why everybody is talking about the 1% and everybody else the 99%, because that big increase at the top of the income distribution has been pronounced and has been sustained. When we look at how income has changed during the 3 years for which we have data available, that is 2007 to 2010, we find a very mixed, in a way, a very different picture. If you look at the top orange, I think, orange-looking oval, you see that the top 1% of the income distribution has seen a decrease in income in the first 2 years of the Great Recession of over 1/3, a huge drop of 36%. The rest, the other 99%, has seen a decrease of about 12%. Moving forward, for the last year we have information available, income of the top 1% has increased by 11.6%, while everybody else's income basically has remained unchanged, so not much going on there. And it is this number, this difference in that income gain from 2009 to 2010 that you see overall in the press and the popular media. And I actually did, this morning I just did a little Google search. I typed in 93% income and I got 11 million Google results on that. And it was, at least what I could see, I didn't go through all 11 million of course, but what I could see was all related to this number. And it's a number that is correct because 93% of all income gains between 2009 and 2010 have accrued to the top 1%, but you can easily see that if we would just widen that period of time to just a couple of more years, we would see a very different result. We would actually see that the share of income of the top 1% has decreased in that period of time. Income inequality is a lot more important if mobility is restricted, right? If people have the feeling and the opportunity to get ahead if they work hard, we care a lot less about income inequality. So I want to talk a bit about mobility. And I want to start by showing you the results of a recent Gallup poll that was done at the end of the last year. And they asked the respondents exactly the type of question we're interested in, that is, how much do you care about policies that are aimed at reducing inequality, and how much do you care about policies that aim at increasing equality of opportunity? And you can see, No, I don't have a mark there. And you can see if you look at the top row that 70% of all respondents said that they find it very important or extremely important that the government enact policies that are aimed at increasing equality of opportunity, but less than 50% found that a reduction in income and wealth gap would be very or extremely important. So people care more about mobility. Now, how do we measure mobility? In general, we look at what's called intergenerational mobility. That is, we look at current adults and we say, okay, what is the economic standing of the current adults compared to their parents? And it's important to keep in mind that these are necessarily backward-looking measures. That is, because we look at current adults, we cannot really say anything about what happened to mobility as a result of the recession or as a result of what happened to the economy in the last couple of years. So it's backward-looking, and that's important to keep in mind. Measuring mobility is difficult. There are many different ways we can think about mobility. Most commonly, we look at income mobility, and I'm going to talk a little more about that. But I also want to mention that another measure of mobility is education, and that's very important, especially for us here at Cal State Fullerton. If we think of mobility, over half of our students are first-generation college students whose parents have not finished their college or do not have a college degree. So for that matter, education and mobility can also tell us a whole lot about what has happened to individuals' lives over time. So what do we know about mobility? There are a lot of different studies out there, and they don't necessarily have the same results. Some of the commonalities I put up here on the slides and I want to talk about, and this is based on research by an economist at the Chicago Fed, Masumda. He finds that mobility has declined sharply in the 1980s. That was at the time where taxes and transfers have become less redistributive. And we've also seen that the type of income that the wealthiest or the highest income earners in our country has leaned more towards labor and labor income and income from businesses and less from capital gains, which was a real important part in that. I'm sorry, I just mixed up my slides. I saw your puzzled looks. What'd she talk? Okay, so let me start that again. So mobility has declined sharply in the 80s, but it has remained relatively constant since then. And that's an important part. So the rise in income inequality was not accompanied by an increase in mobility at the same time. We also know that mobility is strongly related to achievement, to test scores. That's not surprising in that we have found that many times. And studies also show that mobility is lower than was previously thought. And that this idea that America is a much more mobile society than, let's say, European countries does not seem to be supported by the data. And I just want to show you a couple of numbers to illustrate mobility in the US. So when we look at the probability that kids who were born or adults whose parents were in the bottom 20% of the income distribution remain there, we find that that probability is 34%. If you were born to parents in the top of the income distribution, you have an almost 40% probability of remaining there. And that's what's led economists and policy makers to call that the stickiness at the top and the bottom. Right? So you're a lot more likely to stay there than to move into different parts of the distribution. If we look at the probability of moving up, right? That's what we call the upward mobility. You're born to poor parents. What's your probability of going all the way to the other end of the income distribution? You can see that that probability is 7.4%. Downward mobility of children from parents in the top of the income distribution is higher with 11%. So you're born to parents in the top 20%, you have an 11% chance of ending up in the bottom 20% of the distribution. So how do we compare to other countries? If we look at OECD countries, we see that they have seen growing inequality as well since the 1980s. But that the US still has greater income inequality than basically the majority of industrialized and OECD countries. There are 3 exceptions, but these are not countries we normally compare ourselves to. That would be Turkey, Chile, and Mexico. Our tax and transfer system is less redistributive, no surprise here. But at the same time, and that is the important part, mobility in America is also less than in many other parts, less than in Europe, even the UK, which is the most economically similar European country to the US. Also importantly, the differences are great is at the tail, that is the opportunity of moving up when you're born to parents in the bottom of the income distribution. So what to take away? Income inequality has increased in the US. There's no doubt about it. No matter which estimates we use, no matter which numbers we use, income inequality has increased. At the same time, mobility has not. And that is a very important part when we think of the effects of rises in income inequality. And when we compare ourselves to other countries, we find that inequality is greater and mobility is lower than in other countries. Thank you.